During the 2017 NHL season, we had something very rare happen. We didn't have any NHL coaches fired until the end of the season. Now, through the offseason, we've had a fair bit of change. But in today's video, I want to discuss with you the top 5 NHL coaches I think have the most pressure on them, putting them on the hot seat of possibly losing their jobs sometime before the end of the year if things don't go right. We'll discuss those coaches coming up next. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. If you're new to the channel, thanks for stopping by. We review and discuss all 31 NHL teams. So if you're a huge hockey fan, consider subscribing and clicking the bell so you don't miss anything. So as I mentioned off the top, today I want to discuss with you the top 5 NHL coaches I feel have the most pressure on them and are most at risk to losing their job sometime between now and the end of the NHL regular season. Some of these names on the list here today might surprise you a little bit, but first, before we jump into the list, I want to discuss a few coaches who many people probably would put on their list, but I wouldn't put on mine. That includes some teams that aren't expected to be the most competitive this year and might finish near the bottom of the standings, but I just don't feel the coaches have as much pressure on them as some people might think. That includes Montreal Canadiens head coach Claude Julien, Ottawa Senators head coach Guy Boucher, and Detroit Red Wings coach Jeff Blashill. Now, all three of these teams are going through a rebuild. I do think that those teams are going to be patient with these coaches as they understand and realize that they haven't necessarily given the coaches the greatest roster to work with. They're going through a lot of youth movement and things like that, which kind of takes the pressure off the coach. Now, in Ottawa's case with Guy Boucher, he's in the final year of his contract, and as we know, owner Eugene Melnyk is notoriously cheap. He's not going to want to pay another coach yet again to take over for Guy Boucher when he still has to pay him for the remainder of this contract. I really think Ottawa's going to take the wait-and-see approach here. Let Guy Boucher finish out his contract for the year, see how the season goes, see how their youth movement kind of works for this year, see what they have moving forward, and then they'll decide in the offseason, after the 18-19 season, if he's the coach to take this team in the right direction for the future or if they want to go in a different way. Ottawa's notoriously gone through a lot of coaches here over the years. As we know, Melnyk's really cut things back on payroll and other areas of the team. I really don't see him wanting to pay yet another coach to come in when things aren't expected to be great this year anyways, and I'm not sure, even if they had the greatest coach in the world, that we're going to see huge improvements here immediately. This is going to take some time. The organization acknowledges that, so I don't expect any changes in Ottawa in that regard this season. Same goes with the Montreal Canadiens, but for a little bit different reason. Obviously, as I mentioned here, they're going through a rebuild as well, and I do think Marc Bergevin and Jeff Molson are willing to be patient with Claude Julien here in the same respect. Now, Julien's in a different situation contract-wise. He's got a longer-term deal. Claude Julien hasn't really been coaching all that long. He's got a lot of time left on his contract. He's getting paid a handsome salary to do so. Given where everything's at with Montreal's roster and the turnover and the youth movement that they're going through, I just don't see there being a ton of pressure on Julien. The same goes for Detroit Red Wings head coach Jeff Blashill. Now, leading into the last offseason here after the 17-18 season, there was a lot of speculation that Ken Holland, the general manager, as well as Blashill, both might be on the way out of Detroit, but they decided to re-up both of them and keep them both around here, signing shorter term extensions. Now again, Detroit's going through a youth movement. They're going through a major transition here. Henrik Zetterberg had to announce this offseason not long before the season started that he was not able to play anymore, so essentially he's retired. They're kind of going through a changing of the guard there. Jeff Blashill does have a pretty good history in the past of working with younger players, so I do think that that organization is going to be patient with him a little bit longer before they go in a different direction. Now, there is some speculation as well that perhaps we could see Steve Yzerman return to the Red Wings perhaps after this year. As we know, he decided with the Tampa Bay Lightning to step back as general manager. He's now in a different position with the team and only has 1 year left on his deal. So maybe next offseason, perhaps Ken Holland could either step away or move into a new position. And if Steve Yzerman does return to the Red Wings, wouldn't be surprising perhaps at that point if they go with a new coach. Yzerman could kind of hire his own guy or something in that regard. But I don't see a ton of pressure on Blashill here for the short term. So I don't see any of those three guys losing their jobs or being at high risk, at least, to do though this year. Obviously, I can't predict the future. I could be wrong. These teams may opt to make a change, but it really would surprise me. I don't think these guys have a ton of pressure on them at the present time. Now, jumping over to the top 5 that I think do have a lot of pressure on them, there's actually going to be 6 here because I had a hard time narrowing this down, and so I kind of have in the 5th spot, they're basically being a tie. And that includes one of the newer head coaches in the league, and that's Buffalo Sabres head coach Phil Housley. Now, this time last year when we had a similar discussion on this channel, I didn't put Phil Housley on this list because generally speaking, teams are patient with first-year coaches. Now, Phil Housley didn't have a great first year. You can't totally blame Phil Housley for Buffalo's lack of success last year. Obviously, they had a lot of roster issues, and you can only do so much what was on the ice. But thankfully, things worked out with them in the draft, getting Rasmus Dahlin. Jason Botterill's gone out and made several acquisitions throughout the offseason to really bolster this team as well. So I think with all the moves that Botterill has made, I don't think that Housley necessarily has a ton of pressure on him as compared to some of the other guys we're going to discuss a little bit later in this video. But I do think he has more pressure than any of the other guys I just said weren't at risk, or at low risk at least. Given the fact that Botterill's made significant changes and the Sabres should be more competitive this year, if we don't see enough progress this year as the year goes on, I do think Phil Housley will be at risk of potentially losing his job here. I mean, they've gone through a lot of significant changes with this roster, so if they can't see at least significant improvement, then I do think that he could be in jeopardy. Now, I don't think the Sabres have to make the playoffs for him to keep his job, but I do think they need to get themselves out of the basement and at least be close to playoff contention. When we get into the more meaningful part of the year come February, March, if they're completely out of it and they're going to bomb again here and miss the playoffs, at that point in time, I do think Housley will be at risk of getting the axe. But if they are in contention and they're even close to a playoff spot, or at least it's within reach, they've seen some decent progress, then I think Housley will be safe for another year. But I do think with all the changes that Botterill's made, that puts a lot of pressure on Housley to deliver better results for the Sabres. Now, next up, I kind of have tied with him in 5th place here is Joel Quennville of the Chicago Blackhawks. Now, Joel Quennville has been coaching the Hawks for a long time, and he has had a ton of success. There's been a lot of speculation in Chicago over the last year or two, as the results haven't been quite as good as their cup-winning years, if guys like him or Stan Bowman might be in jeopardy. So far, they haven't made a change. It also has been known, though, that the Hawks ownership really expect high expectations of their team. They expect the team to be competitive and win. And at some point here, if they can get things turned around with what they have, then we very well might see some changes. Now, I do think the Hawks owe Quennville a ton of respect here. He's accomplished a lot of things. He's helped bring 3 Stanley Cups here in recent years, so I do think that they need to tread carefully here. He's a tremendous coach, arguably one of the greatest of all time, but at some point in time, you need a different voice in that room. If they can't get the results with what they have here, then he could be on the hot seat. Now, before they make a move like that, the Hawks might go in a different direction and try to tinker more with the roster, but there's only so much they can do, as a lot of their core players are tied up long-term, big money, a lot of no movement clause, and a lot of that falls on the GM, Stan Bowman. Now, I've said here before that I thought Stan Bowman should be under just as much pressure as Quennville, and perhaps the Hawks might not make a move here this year. Maybe we'll see how the year goes, and they can kind of do it at the same time if they decide to next offseason. I do think the Hawks will be a little bit more patient with these two, and it very well could come towards the end of the year if things don't go right, or possibly into next season. But I do think Quennville has a lot of pressure on him to deliver and bring the Hawks back to a little bit more of a higher standing here, and we'll see how things go with the Hawks this year. Next up, we got Randy Carlyle of the Anaheim Ducks. Now, the Ducks are a team I've talked a lot about here since really towards the end of the offseason when we started making predictions and projections for the upcoming year. I do have a lot of concerns about the Ducks this year due to the vast amount of injuries that they're starting the season with. As we know, Corey Perry's going to be out for about 5 months with a knee injury. They've got Ryan Kesler and Patrick Eaves not in the lineup, and it's unclear when they're going to return. They've also got youngster Andre Kasha, who's been a tremendous help for them recently, out with a concussion. It's not clear how long he'll be out. They do have some other younger players in the lineup that are performing well. Guys like Ricard Raquel and Silverberg and Henrique will certainly, I think, keep them up there in the standings a little bit. And youngsters like Sam Steele and Troy Terry, Maxime Comtois, all will have an impact on this team in some capacity as well. They do have an excellent goalie in John Gibson, and they also have a great young decor as well. So I do think there's a lot of things to like about the Ducks, but with all the forward group that they have out injured, I do have some concerns about their ability to keep up the offense and keep the wins coming. So therefore, I do think that if Anaheim stumbles, given his tenure with the club, that Randy Carlyle could be under a lot of pressure and potentially be at risk of being replaced. Of course, General Manager Bob Murray might cut him some slack, giving all the injuries, so I don't think Carlyle has as much pressure on him as some of the other guys we're going to discuss further up this list. But I do think if the Ducks stumble like I'm predicting this year, that Carlyle, unfortunately, could be on the chopping block. Next up, we've got Mike Yeo of the St. Louis Blues. Now, we saw the St. Louis Blues' first game of the season against the Winnipeg Jets, and things did not go very well at all. Throughout this offseason, General Manager Doug Armstrong is another guy for his team who's made significant changes. They've obviously made a big trade, bringing in Ryan O'Reilly. He signed several free agents for this club this offseason, including David Perron, Tyler Bozak, Patrick Maroon. So they really got wholesale changes Up front here at the forward group, they've also got youngsters Robert Thomas and Jordan Kyrou, Sammy Blais getting a little bit more ice time as well. So there's really significant changes amongst the forward group for the St. Louis Blues. So when a team makes significant changes to really help the coach out and the results don't come, that usually results in a lot of pressure being pointed at them. Now, of course, one of the big things that's going to impact the Blues season, which we kind of already seen a little bit in game number 1, is their goaltending. They need consistent, solid goaltending out of number 1 netminder Jake Allen. Unfortunately, he did not deliver that in the first game of the year. Now, of course, they were playing the Winnipeg Jets, so I do want to cut them a little bit of slack here. Winnipeg is a tremendous hockey team and really helped cause a lot of the problems that St. Louis were on the other side of here in that game. So I don't think you can completely blame the Blues. You can kind of credit some of that to being Winnipeg being such a great team. At the same time, though, they need solid goaltending to take them to a next level, and they really need to get that this year, and that's going to be a big part of St. Louis' success or lack thereof this year. So I do think if things aren't going well for the Blues and they're stumbling out of the blocks either early or midway through the year and things aren't looking good, that Armstrong very well might go to make a move here and change the coach before it gets too late to hopefully give this team a better shot at getting back into the playoffs. So I do think Mike Yeo of the St. Louis Blues does have a lot of pressure, and if the Blues don't deliver, he could be another name to keep your eye out for. Next up, we got Todd McLellan of the Edmonton Oilers. Now, as we know, the Oilers had a terrible year last year, coming off a season before that where they get themselves back into the playoffs and had a second-round loss against the Anaheim Ducks in a Game 7 matchup. So they actually had a really solid year the year before. Things were going in the right direction, and then they completely fell off the tracks last year, missed the playoffs, and really had a really down season by all means. Connor McDavid personally had a great year. The rest of the team, not so much. Everybody else was pretty much down and just falling apart. Now, so far, leading into this year, especially during the preseason here, the Oilers have looked much better. But if they continue to stumble, then it's going to have to be fall square on the head coach, Todd McLellan. I mean, when you have a player like Connor McDavid and you have all these other youngsters in the lineup, if the things aren't going well, it does come back down to strategy and how the players are being used, and it does fall on the coaches. So I do think Todd McLellan is under a lot of pressure for the Oilers to deliver a much better season, and anything short of getting back into the playoffs, I do think will result in his termination. So hopefully for the Oilers' sake, with McDavid and Draisaitl and all these strong guys in the lineup, they can bounce back, have better years, and that won't happen. But I do think if things aren't going well for the Oilers this year, McLellan is in serious jeopardy. Now, the top guy on my list here for the most pressure on him to deliver this year is Minnesota Wild head coach Bruce Boudreau. Now, Bruce Boudreau, in my opinion, is under a lot of pressure. Obviously, as we know, Minnesota is a state of hockey, is hungry for some wins, hungry to deliver a Stanley Cup. So as we've seen this past offseason, owner Craig Leopold removed general manager Chuck Fletcher, brought in Paul Fenton from Nashville. At this point, Fenton hasn't really done a whole lot to kind of shake this team up and leave his mark on it to really see significant improvements. So I've stated in other videos, prediction series and whatnot, that I do have concerns over the Wild possibly taking a step back, and their streak of making the playoffs very well could be in jeopardy this season. I do expect Fenton to likely make some trades and some deals throughout the year to kind of shape this club and make his mark here and kind of mold things to what he thinks they need to do to win. However, when we see general managers come in with an existing coach, at some point, if there's not immediate success, you quite often do see a case of the general manager, replacing them with their own guy that they like to bring in. The Minnesota Wild play in an incredibly tough Central Division against tough teams like the Winnipeg Jets, Nashville Predators. We saw big improvements, at least on paper, by the St. Louis Blues and the Dallas Stars this year. So those improvements really show in the standings as well. The Minnesota Wild are going to be in very tough this year, and I do think that they're in serious jeopardy of taking a step back, finishing lower in the standings, and missing the playoffs, ending their playoff streak right now. So if that's the case, between having a new GM and everything going on with the Wild, I do think Bruce Boudreau is under a lot of pressure here. I think he might be the first coach to be let go this year, or very well at least the coach under the most pressure. Now, of course, any of these guys in this list that we're talking about, if they deliver better results and they're winning and they're being successful in the standings, then obviously that takes the pressure off and likely saves them their job. But if any of these teams that were discussed here today kind of stumble and don't get the results they need to be competitive and be considered for the playoffs or where their teams expect them to be, I do think they have the most pressure on them and are at the highest risk of losing their job. So as always, I'd love to hear your comments down below in the comment section. Let me know, who do you think has the most pressure on them for NHL coaches this year? Who needs to deliver some results or is on high risk of being fired? If you're new to the channel here, I hope you consider subscribing. We cover all 31 NHL teams, and there's plenty of content here for all hockey fans to enjoy. So if you're new, hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button as well. I'd really appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you very much for watching, everybody. We will catch you next time.